I heard you had the flu. You and several others. A few others. Well, good morning. We start the year off light. So be it. Hey, we're going to continue to be in. That's somebody else's seat. Well, we can start off with a little prayer. We need to continue to pray for Kevin. Pray for Kevin. He's just, it's really difficult. He's just fighting for his life, and just seems that one thing after another, and this has to get right for that to happen, and that's not getting right, and it's just really, really tough there. So let's go ahead. Father, thank you for your mercy and your grace, that you love us, you care for us, and that even when it seems just so impossible, we know that you're there, and we just want to pray for our brother Kevin, and that he's just so fighting for his life, and has had one major complication after another, and Father, just pray that you could bring about healing. Father, pray that you would lift up Cindy and her daughter Lauren as they so carry the weight and the stress of that, and we just pray your mercy and your grace there. And Father, we trust in you, and we hope in you, and pray that we as your people, your body here, can provide the help and encouragement to them and help to sustain them in this very difficult time. And we know we have many others that are dealing with a lot of stuff, and we just pray for them also, and that you have us here so that we can be with each other and sustain and love as you have with us. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, I'm filling in for Art today, and this is my title of what he's been doing. So I couldn't remember exactly what he has called our class, but I'm not continuing where he ended last week, but rather we are covering the same subject. And what I hope to do is to kind of give a little bit more of an overview kind of today, and we won't get through all that, but wanted to touch on that. Now, why are we studying this? I mean, when you look at a title like this, you go, that's really academic. You know, what does that mean? Well, again, in other words, after or when they got hauled off first to Assyria, and then about 125 years later to Babylon, okay, they were displaced. And so you go from this very kind of exclusive view, and as we read in the scriptures, we kind of see that in the discussions and how the people are to be. And now they're carted off to these other areas, not all of them, but many of them. And in that, things happen and so on, and we view that as, they were learning their lesson, repenting, and then God brought them back and things like that. Well, when you go through experiences like that, they have profound effects on how you view and understand things. And we all can relate to that with events in our own life and so on and so forth. And it causes us to reconsider, either to be more firmly entrenched in what we understand, or being open to realizing that, hey, maybe what I thought on this wasn't the end-all, be-all in things. And so what happened in this period of time, not only exile and the return and to the time of Christ, is that there was a lot of forces and things that were at work and changing their view and their understanding that affected the way the apostles, Jesus, and that whole early Christian world understood things. Just like we cannot explain Judaism by saying, well, I've studied the Old Testament. Well, that isn't the same today, meaning what we would think of if we understand how the Jewish people were then. That doesn't quite connect totally to today. It's very different. It's very evolved from what that was. And so similar, these kind of things. Uh-oh. Heidi, you got me stopped? There we go. So one's faith and understanding of God and the Scriptures, as we've said, is influenced by the culture and events in which one lives. And those experiences and perceptions are a filter or lens through which we look, and the influences how we perceive and understand whether we are aware of that or not. And no one can fully free themselves from influences no matter how hard one tries, but we can try to be aware of them. And so again, I've kind of pressed that theme, but it's very true in what we're studying here. So it is with this period. The post-exilic or Second Temple period dates from approximate return of the Israelites from captivity in Babylon in 516 BCE to the destruction of the temple by Rome in 70 CE. And that's a period of about 600 years. Now, at the time that Israel was carted off to Babylon, 125 years before that is when, as they call it, the northern kingdom was shipped off to Assyria, and, you know, whatever happened from that. That's what they call the lost tribes of Israel. Well, it was that group. And so there was these tumultuous things that happened in this time period. Heidi, you sticking me again? What am I doing? There we go. And so as we look at the map here, really simply, just to refresh us, here, of course, is Israel, the Levant. It's a new term in our terminology, thanks to Art. Here's Israel. Babylon's over here. Persia's over here. Assyria's up here. Egypt is down here. And so this was an area that over time was constantly, these forces and empires were going through back and forth and back and forth. And we read about some of that in our Old Testament passages. And so it was conquered and not, and it's just lots of things happened there. And so just wanted to get that overview of what was happening. And so here is, excuse me, golly, messing up here. Here is what we would call, what we now call the Middle East. Turkey's up here, and so and this has also been called in the old days they called this the Orient, and so we think of the Orient as like China and Asia, and things like that. Well, in historical archaeology and things, this is referred to, and so the Chicago Museum of Oriental whatever is referring to this. And if you go up to it, you'll see all these things from Assyria and Babylon. Pardon? Well, this is also referred to as Asia Minor. And so lots of different things there. So the period we're looking at is right in here. The end of what they call the Old Testament canon. And of course, remember the canon is the word for a reed or a measuring stick or a rule. And so their Old Testament canon didn't really fully come together as far as acknowledged till actually a little later on. However, this is about, so here we got Malachi right before 400. Here's Daniel. And so this period here that is often called the intertestamental period, okay, and some have called it the period of silence because we see, well, Malachi's here, and then until we get the Gospels, and somehow like God wasn't working, or that there was nothing else being written or whatever. But we're basing that on the idea of here's our canon, and then here's our canon. Okay? But there was a tremendous amount of things that went on in this period and greatly influenced how, in this period, things were perceived and influenced, especially things in the spiritual realm. And so that's kind of what we're touching on. Now, I want to look at this passage here just to illustrate quickly from Matthew. And we're not unfamiliar with this, but after presenting the parables of the sower and the weeds and the mustard seed, Jesus was asked to explain them. That's what's going on here. And so in Matthew 13, 37 through 43, NIV, says, he answered, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. And the field is the world. And the good seed are the people of the kingdom. The poisonous weeds are people of the evil one. And the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. As the poisonous weeds are collected and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. And the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin as well as all lawbreakers. And they will throw them into the fiery furnace, and where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father, and the one who has ears had better listen. And so we see this explanation and this warning. And we see in here this very apocalyptic scenery, which we're very familiar with because of Revelation, and of course some with Daniel, and so on. And so we see this imagery that Jesus is projecting. He's using his rural imagery, weeds, and wheat and things like that kind of stuff. But then it's clothing it in this kind of view of things. Now, as with many such stories, we said Jesus used commonplace rural imagery. He framed it, though, in a worldview that made many assumptions about spiritual realities, as well as the universe and its hierarchies. Forces of good and evil, light and dark, contend in the world until God's final victory. People must be urgently concerned about these conflicts because their conduct in the present world affects their fate in the afterlife. Now, this is not unfamiliar to us. This kind of, duh. Like, that's what it's always said. That's what it, okay? And it is, not disputing any of that. And so, because we're so far on this side of all this, this is like, that's the way it is. Okay? Well, these basic understandings, as we said, are not surprising to anyone who knows the religious history of the West, meaning basically Western European and the influence of Christianity. Angels and judgments, Messiah and Satan, hell and demons. These are familiar building blocks, if you will. They're also embedded in our DNA from 2,000 years of Christian art and are integrated into a complex system. So, for example, when you think of an angel, what do you think of? What do you visualize? What do you visualize? Key part being wings, right? Well, and powerful things such as that. Well, where do these come from? Well, it comes from so many years. We just always, well, of course, that's what they are. And the Scripture doesn't necessarily clarify that to that degree. Now, not saying that's wrong or terrible or evil or whatever, but nonetheless, these things come in and impact us. What few of us today aren't really as aware of is that from such a passage as the one we just read about Jesus, is how new those themes were at the time Jesus was presenting them. In other words, at the time Jesus was presenting them, that was already kind of embedded in them. In other words, they were after these things, and it kind of became the common assumptions, common understanding, common lore. But that was pretty new when we look back at what we would call the Old Testament. And because in the Old Testament, there isn't nearly as much reference to that. We assume that these ideas are sourced in the Bible, and I'm not saying there isn't some things with that, but however common they are in the New Testament, they are not firmly rooted in the Old. During the period covered by the Hebrew Bible, what we would call our Old Testament, up to around 400 BCE, which we saw on that chart, few of those ideas existed in Jewish thought, and those that did were not prominent. So while we have some Daniel, and we have, some, referring Sodom and Gomorrah and the angels and things, you don't see lots of, it's not permeating what we would call the Old Testament. So how did this come about? To where it's not very prominent, to where, wow, there's a lot of language about that. There's a lot of writings that were more along the line of what would be our revelation. There was a lot of those around the time of Jesus and that period before. By the start of the Common Era, and just for, we all know what this is, but remember the ideas of the AD, and that's the Latin, and I can't remember what that Latin word is. We take that as after Christ, and then the BC, before Christ, if you will. And that was changed, and that was changed by people thought, wow, that's really Christian-centric. And so when you look at this broader world, and so that's why they got before the Common Era and the Common Era, same dates, just different heading. And so by the start of the Common Era, these assumptions about the spiritual world were deeply and thoroughly integrated and acclimatized into the Jewish worldview. And they have shaped Western faith and culture ever since. And so the apostles would have understood. That wasn't like, wow, where'd you come up with this? And things like this. This was more the way they looked at things because of the time that they were in. So much of what we think of as a Judeo-Christian spiritual universe, if you want to call it that, was conceived and described after what we would call the closure of the Old Testament text. Okay, in other words, these ideas didn't seem to be very prominent here, and then all of a sudden we get to here, and it's like, whoa, where did some of these develop and come from? Virtually every component of that system entered the Jewish world in the 2 or 3 centuries before the Common Era. And we can identify a critical moment in transformation around the year 250 BCE. And we'll go, well, what's 250? Why 250? Remember, when historians look at things and they're trying to look at significant events or origins of things or where they can most perceive, they try to look for something and so they can put a date on it. And if those things may have been brewing and percolating prior to that, sometimes a long time prior to that, they've just kind of fully bloomed and emerged and so on. So anyhow, that's historical dates. We've talked about that. During the 2 tempestuous centuries between 250 BCE and 50 CE, the Jewish-derived worldview was a crucible of values, faiths, and ideas from which emerged a wholly new religious synthesis. In other words, you got all these influences coming in, and they're influencing one's understanding of the world and things such as that, and so it was also with the Jewish people. Such a sweeping transformation of religious thought in a relatively brief period, because remember, things often take hundreds of years. Rather, we think today, well, that was just, last week, or a few months ago. We're thinking the speed of today. It's really hard for us to really kind of look back and comprehend hundreds of years. Well, hundreds of years. And so this was relatively brief, but this was one of the most revolutionary times in what they would call Western culture, where these biggest influences were happening. And these years, in effect, created what we would call our Western consciousness, or way of looking at things. And so art, in the detail that he's giving us, we spent a lot of time on agriculture, for example, last week. Well, these things are also the influences into their understanding. Now, this is more kind of he was kind of going a little more micro, and this is a little macro, but nonetheless. The emerging belief system was not the creation of isolated thinkers or writers who made it up on a whim. Wasn't just a few people sitting in a room, hey, let's change the way everybody thinks about everything. Though there are those that try. On the contrary, these new ideas developed in direct response to the cultural crisis and political events of that era, that intertestamental times. And it can only be understood in that context. Just like the 60s didn't just pop up. 60s didn't just pop up. And so as we looked at my previous class I was doing over time, we saw that these things here influence what happened up here. And so it is with this, but certainly on a longer time frame. And so the period began with the Hellenistic kingdoms that ruled the Middle East during the 3rd century. A Jewish encounter with globalizing modernity that produced both social tumult and effervescent creativeness. In other words, there's all this social turmoil, but there was also this, and we're going to look at it here in a second, what effervescence creativity looks like. And these centuries, and it may taste better, but these centuries were marked by such themes as massive expansion of cities and commercial economics and persistent conflict between native peoples and foreign rulers, and the growing importance of the diaspora communities. Okay, let's talk about this a minute. What does Hellenistic mean? The Greeks called themselves the Hellenes. And so the word Hellenistic comes to refer to the spreading of Greek culture. Specifically, it's dealing with Alexander and his spreading of Greek culture in a very short period of time. Was it 3 years? 3 or 4 years, he conquered the, quote, known world, known to them, a whole lot in a short time. And so, when you think you're successful, you think I'm successful because of all the things I know and believe, and this is better than that, and so on and so forth, so you're going to start doing it too because it's better than what you got. Okay? And so that's what Hellenistic culture is. And so when Alexander died, they broke up the empire into, I think there was 4 generals. 3 generals? Well, but they kind of broke it up. Well, whatever happened in a short time, you had basically 2 or 3 of them kind of gathered it all together, because there's a lot of egos there, and I'm gonna take control. But anyhow, and so the area in Egypt was the Ptolemies, of which Cleopatra and all them kind of came from. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, which was huge and so important in so many things and in Christian history, however good or unsavory that may be, was one of these cities, one of these Hellenistic cities. Pergamon up in Turkey, and we're going to look at something from there. But however, in Israel, the Seleucids, that was the general, I don't know if his name was Seleucid, I can't remember, but, and so you see these broke up. And so this is what's going on. Remember when Art was pointing out how big Jerusalem was. No, it was not very big. Jerusalem could have fit on probably our property at times he's talking about, and so on. So very rural, well, you start getting these giant cities. And of course, when they're forceful and doing things like that, they go, hey, you're moving to this city. We need you to populate that. So there was a growth of these cities. And so very different. And so all this change, all this stuff going on. And of course, the diaspora was the Jews that were originally exiled out of Israel, first by the Assyrians, though I think it's the Babylonian ones that are more looked at as that. And then they some of them stayed. And so their understanding of things influenced where they were at in those other places. And of course, there were those that came back. So here in the Hellenistic world, we have, of course, here is, Palestine. There's Jerusalem. There is Antioch there, where they were first called Christians in Acts. Here's Pergamon up here. Alexandria, Egypt, is here. And so, again, we see this world. Here's the Ptolemaic kingdom. Here's the Seleucid kingdom. And this was another smaller variant of things. And so it was huge, and that's all they knew. So here is artist's rendition of Pergamon, which was up there in Turkey. And this particular structure, this particular structure here is, I think, in one of the German museums in Berlin. I think it was Berlin, maybe it was Munich. Sorry, I didn't look at the details. And there's some really famous, there's some very famous, on these friezes here, sculptural friezes, and there's some really famous stuff on there that influenced some other sculptures that you've seen. But it kind of came from that. And so you see these magnificent, they call them treasure cities, so to speak. And again, very, very different from, Edina, Missouri, so to speak, the small little towns. And so all this upheaval, what does that do to your thinking and your understanding? Where you're now put into this world and see these things that you haven't seen before and experienced before. It's going to affect you in some way, shape, or form. I'm not saying that's all bad. It could be good. But this awareness of these things. Throughout this period, the Jews were in intimate contact with powerful religious and intellectual influences from the Mesopotamian religions and the Persian Zoroastrian beliefs to the multiple philosophical currents of Hellenism. So all these things are being thrown at you in the cooking pot together, if you will, making some gumbo, or however that is. Such intoxicating ideas could not fail to leave their impact on Jewish thinkers. But these new directions were not merely a response to the foreign influences and imports. Yes, the Zoroastrian faith, and we're not going to go into high detail about what Zoroastrianism is, because it can be all over the place. But they taught ideas such as the Last Judgment, and something like the devil and angels. And the Jews and Christians borrowed from Greek terminology and imagery, as we're going to see in a moment. And so there's all these things. And so there's this connection. In Zoroastrianism, there's this idea, and this was an AI image, so just showing you. And so there's a supreme God. And so here you are in a foreign country, and you go, they have this concept of a supreme God. And then they also had much about darkness and light and these battles going on between these forces. Well, I've heard that somewhere. Oh, wait, isn't that what Revelation is? Remember, Revelation is not the only writing on those kind of things. That's just the only one we have in our New Testament that they've deemed to go. There was a lot of that. And our apostles and others would have been familiar with at least some of that and perhaps read them or heard them read or heard the ideas expounded from those things. But the picture is not quite as simple as scholars once believed, and as you dig into history, we find out rarely is it. Things are usually a lot more complex than we realize in our summarized versions of things. In the Zoroastrian case, we are much less confident than we once were, than we might have once have been exactly when these religious themes emerged in the Persian setting and how they were transfused into the Jewish worldview. In other words, it's not clear. Why? Because we're so far on this side of when it happened, and trying to dig back and find evidence of that, and a lot of times some of that stuff's guessing based on other things, and that's just what history is on a lot of stuff, especially way back. However, these things were there. Similarly, with the Greeks, multiple schools of thought affected the Jewish world. Some like Platonism, that's Plato. Plato, followed by Socrates, are the two big boys, if you will, of Greek thought. Not that there weren't others, because there were, but those were the major ones. And that influenced Christian thought later. We'll talk about that in a second. And so this is very brief. Plato was the older, founded the school of Athens. Aristotle was a student that came along later. In a giant, big picture thing, what's the difference? Plato said that this world is just these shadowy images of what reality is in the spiritual world. I think it's called forms. And so these are kind of a poor reflection of what's really up there. Well, we can understand that why to Christian thinking, spiritual, the heavens, better, in other words, kind of connections. And so Platonic thought greatly influenced many of the early Christian fathers, thinkers, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and so on. Why is that? Because Greek philosophy and thought of Plato and Aristotle dominated everything. You couldn't escape it. And so if I'm trying to work and understand Christianity and what's being said, and in a sense the whole world in which area I live thinks that way, how can I connect Jesus to that way of thinking? And that's the beginnings of what you call apologetics. which we're not unfamiliar with? How do you connect or relate the message of the Bible, of gospel of Christ, with this world? Those are questions we're asking ourselves now in the world in which we live. When they said so many don't go anymore, they've kind of rejected. It's not connecting. And so how does one make it connect? Well, that's kind of what this is, and it influences them. Aristotle was one that thought differently. He was more like the science guy. He was more like, you know what, we need to look and see what we see in front of us. And so it was more focused that way. And then that way of thinking, when they rediscovered is the wrong, maybe not the right term, but it's what's used. When that was rediscovered in the later or the earlier Middle Ages, if you will, that growing of the influence or re-influence of Aristotle ended up bringing about the Renaissance. And later the Enlightenment, which we've chronicled, greatly influenced the thinking of our fellowship, certainly in the beginning. And so anyhow, so these are things that are going on and have always gone on, whether we're aware of them or not. It is not the question whether external influences were available, but rather which of them appealed most to the needs and tastes of the given time. The demand side of the equation mattered as much as the supply side. And the demand was high. In other words, there was a thirst for understanding. How can I understand my world? I got these armies and these empires marching in and out and conquering and doing this and forcing this upon us and all these things. God, where are you? What's going on? And these foreign currents flooded into a Jewish world that was quite independently in the course of their own reconstruction and was a natural and logical outgrowth of strict monotheism. Now, hold on, what are you saying? Well, all this stuff that had happened to Israel, Syria, Babylon, you're exposed to a lot of different things. And so there's a challenge to one's worldview, at least as it had been established. And as Art pointed out in the class early on, in what the Old Testament, as they've best been able to see, there was not the monotheism as we understand it early on. I mean, just reading Genesis, about Abraham and then the others around and all that, and so on and so forth. And of course, God's saying you need to, put them away. You need to take out all the Canaanites because they're going to be a bad influence on you, so on and so forth. Well, that's some of that understanding. And so it changed. And somehow his reading seemed that it happened in that 700 to 600 period where it started becoming a more exclusively monotheistic, meaning there aren't other gods, they're just wood, they're just stone, so on and so forth, rather than in this pantheon, in this universe, there's all this battle going on. And so in the 7th and 6th centuries, that's when you have them carted off to Assyria and have them carted off to Babylon. That's when this is happening. And so that brought about troubling questions about the means by which God could act in history. In other words, if God's in control of everything, what's he doing? How is he doing it? Questions we have today. Okay? Monotheism created an intellectual need, if you will, for intermediary figures. In other words, how does God carry out his plan, what he's trying to do is what that means. Who enacted the divine will in his stead, and this kind of necessitate is maybe the wrong word, but a fast-growing belief in the reality and power of angels. In other words, this understanding made sense as to how those things can happen. And so you see this explosion of writings and different things about angelic beings and the spiritual warfare going on in this intertestamental time period that didn't seem to be there in quantity, if you will, in what we would call that Old Testament canon period. Didn't say non-existent, just not the quantity. And so why is that? My whole world is blowing up with all these empires marching in and out, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Kind of like probably if you're in Europe in World War I and World War II. You see your whole world blown up. It changes thinking, and it brought around some dark thinking, if you will, in Europe. But anyhow, meanwhile, the attempts to explain the existence of evil in the divinely ordained system inspired an obsessive interest in dark angels and in Satan. And some people are still very into that. They need to see justice in the divine order. How is it made right? And we as Christians have gone to say, well, it'll be right in the end. It'll be all right in the end. No matter what's happening here, it'll be right in the end. Well, that falls into that line of thinking. This divine order inspired a vital new belief in the concepts of the afterlife and the resurrection. You see very little in the Old Testament talking about the afterlife. There's some, they bring up Samuel from the dead and the witch of Endor and so on and so forth, but you don't see a lot. You start seeing a lot. Now, remember what the battle was between the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Pharisees believed in the resurrection. Sadducees did not. Whoa. That happened in this period we're talking about, that development and that strengthening of that understanding and that belief. And of course, rewards and punishment. Now, here's that big word, eschatology. That's what the academics use, describing the study of these things, and it can get very involved. So eschatology is not just the premillennial, late great planet Earth, these locusts are the Russian helicopters that are coming down from Gog and Magog and all that. That's eschatology too, but it all falls in that realm. Now, the Persian and the Greek worldviews were welcomed into the Jewish system that was already in headlong transformation. In other words, all these things are happening and accelerated changes that were already in process. Now, in the Middle East is rampant with these images, these combination of these fantastic creatures, winged creatures, lions, eagles, all combining these characteristics into one, and also on the human side, as we see on some of these. And this wasn't just in Babylon. This was Assyria. This was the Persians, and even the Greeks and Romans to a degree. And of course, we also know in Egypt. And so this combining of these fantastic creatures were not unknown. We see here in this one that the human figure with the wings. Okay, and then of course on my left, your left too. You see the Venus of Samothrace, which is one of the most famous winged images in the whole world. This was from the island of Samothrace, and this was on the bow of a ship. And I think it's in the Louvre. And so this imagery, and on the right, we have the Archangel Michael. Michael, right? Michael, not Gabriel. Michael. Okay. And where'd they come from? appropriated from these things that were more familiar. Jews were in frequent contact with other groups, and they had to decide how those strangers related to their own world and their God. If there was one God, then there must in some sense be the God of the whole world. And this gets into what's called universalism. Okay, in other words, it said if God is just the God of us and not these people here, but if God made the whole world and God's over the whole world, what does that mean? And so universalism is a concept that some things apply to all rather than just a few. Okay? Now, where have we seen that? Well, Israel. Israel was saying, hey, God, not them. And we see the idea of the pagan and, the Gentile and the Jew. We see the world divided up, all in Scripture, with that kind of thinking and that kind of separatism and exclusiveness. Okay? Well, wait. What does that mean if God wants all to be, and so on and so forth? That's what these questions are. Was truth designed for only one racial group, if you will? Or could others adopt it? Can others come in? Wasn't that the big argument Paul was dealing with in Galatians and other places? It was that very concept he was dealing with then. Most daringly, might the spiritual universe expand to include other beings that could be understood as being godlike? In other words, this broadening of this pantheon of angels and demons, devils, and things like that. And could Jewish rulers dare to appropriate Greek and foreign styles of authority, which raised kings to their near divine status, and sometimes not just near, as in the Romans, and so on. And so we see these things are coming up, these questions, because of all these things that have come in and influenced and affected their whole lives, their whole way of doing things. And we would be no different. Some questions became acute when so many Jews lived outside of Palestine in the widespread diaspora. In other words, me, here in Palestine, I got my, I'm kind of, they weren't insulated. But you're out in these other areas, these cities, these this or that or other things. Well, becomes very prominent. And we see, and we've talked about, how country thinking is different than city thinking, so to speak. Okay? We see that in song. Country good, city bad. Big city, turn me loose and set me free. Somewhere in the middle of Montana. That was gospel according to Merle Haggard. Okay? On big city there, if you will. But these kind of themes that we're more right, we're cities corrupting, nature, rural life, uncorrupted, so on and so forth. These ideas have been, in the diaspora, you're a whole lot more aware of it if you're living in one of those settings, like the city and things like that. And of course, remember, the diaspora was a dispersion of Jews outside of Palestine. And initially it was from the exile, but then later it became all over. And Alexandria, Egypt, was the largest Jewish community outside of Israel at one time. And so I'm just saying, these things affect. Judaism was founded on the principles of one God and one holy people in the sacred land. How then could people sing the Lord's song in strange and different countries of the diaspora? In other words, this was alien to them just as much as it is the other way. And so what happens? And of course, who are these three guys? The supposed three wise men. Now that bow looks like the same kind of bow I've had on presents. This is some AI-generated thing, but I just wanted to make the point that it's thought that these guys weren't Jews. These guys were folks from Babylon, it's thought, Zoroastrian probably in belief, and there's some similarities. Astrologers. And again, you know, whatever all that was, and yet they enter into the biblical story and to worship Christ. Okay? Probably when he was about 1 or 2 years old, but we all understand that. But in those times when you combine everything, it just makes it a little neater and more complex. All right, well, we'll have to stop there. And so I think Art is back with us again next week, and I'm sorry I couldn't get into the Apocrypha and the pseudo-graphical writings, which I wanted to, just real quick. But so hopefully this presents a little bit of a broader overview of kind of the things that are working on, and whereas Art's kind of providing a lot of details, and as we're trying to figure this out. So thank you very much.